So we need to hit continue. And we're up and running. Buddy, another gorgeous summer evening. We're really tickled to have Mike Lesinski, who's really gone through a lot of hoops to join us tonight, and I appreciate that, Mike, big time.
Yeah, no worries.
Mike is a forester for the past 22 years. He's currently with Weyerhaeuser, as I indicated in my intro email to everybody. Mike is going to talk to us about a sustainable forestry management. And, you know, one of the questions I have, and we'll address that with Mike at the end of the introduction or the end of his presentation, is I'm really wondering about all these catastrophic forest fires we have every summer now. I understand there is some global climate change that's a factor in there, but I also wonder if there isn't something to do with not real good stewardship of the resource. And so now we have these huge tinder boxes ready to go off, and they're making summers really difficult out west. So I'll have Mike weigh in on that at the end of his talk. But for right now, let's give the floor to Mike. And thanks once again, Mike, a ton, and I owe you a beer for this, and I'll let you take it away, okay?
Yep, thank you, Joe. Well, a little bit more about me. I generally start with this slide any presentation that I do. I have a BS in forestry from Michigan State, graduated in the 90s, I guess. I have a master's degree in operations management from Kettering University, so that would be a business degree. Been in the field for about 23 years, 17 years in the industry side of it, and I spent 6 years with the Michigan DNR in the Baldwin field office, Cadillac unit. I'm a past chair of the Michigan SFI Implementation Committee, so that's Sustainable Forestry, or the immediate past chair. I'll go into that a little bit more a little later. And just my disclaimer, I'm not an ornithologist, so you guys probably know more about individual bird species than I do, so please be gentle as I go along here.
We'll do our best.
Okay. One other thing too, I am very informal in my presentations, so if there are questions, feel free to jump in. You do not have to save them for the end. We can kind of address things as we go. That does not bother me or throw me off, and at least I know I'm not putting you to sleep at that point. A little bit about Weyerhaeuser Company. We're over 100 years old at this point, 120 years old. We're one of the world's largest forest products companies, employing 13,000 people globally. Most of our operations are in the US and Canada. At this point, in both the United States and Canada, we are the largest private owner of timberland in both countries. I think we're up to maybe 12 million acres in the United States and maybe 14 million acres in Canada, or that could be flip-flop, somewhere right in that area. We operate under 3 business segments, so timberlands, wood products, and real estate. Our timberlands is actually our timberland owner or owning organization. They would be the ones that manage that own timberland. Wood products is what I work in, and then real estate, there is some amount of buying and selling of real estate that goes on, along with long-term leasing, hunting leases, mineral rights, things of that nature. Our wood products segment that I work in, we're comprised of lumber, engineered lumber, and oriented strand board. And oriented strand board would be what I fall under at this point. So in Michigan, the mill is in Grayling. We've been operating there since 1982. We employ about 160 people. As I said, we produce oriented strand board, or OSB. If you're not familiar with that, just terminology wise, that would be the particle board. You can see the picture up in the right-hand corner of my slide that you see new construction being built with. So you'll see that on flooring and exterior sheathing for both walls and roofs. The distribution of our products is mainly to the north central states. You don't see our board in Lowe's or Home Depot because they just kind of go with the lowest cost board that they can get. Most of our stuff you would find at Menards, or if you go to Standard Lumber, you'll see it there, or Carter Lumber. More of the specialized lumber yards is where you see our board. In the mill here in Grayling, we use all wood species except oak, hickory, and locust. The reason that we don't use oak, because there's a lot of it around, is that that just doesn't produce high quality OSB. It doesn't bond well when you press it, and there's also some appearance issues with that. It tends to mold and not look good. Our wood comes from all over the state. So we buy wood from private landowners. We buy it from consulting foresters. We buy it from the federal government. We buy it from the state government as well too. And then everything we buy is certified to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative standard. So what does that mean? Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI, it promotes sustainable forest management. It's third-party audited, and it's ensuring that, you know, large wood-consuming mills are addressing non-timber qualities such as, you know, water quality, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, threatened and endangered species, you know, things of that nature. It also, a segment of that is that all the logging contractors that we would use to harvest wood on our tracks, or on the tracks that we buy from private landowners, have to go through continuing education classes on, you know, special biological diversity issues to stay in conformance with the program. So it ensures that anybody that we have working for us is trained at least to a minimum standard. And then if you look at the bottom of the page there where it says certified sourcing, that is actually a label off of the wrap on our board. So I took that picture in our mill. That you'll see that stamp on other products at Lowe's or Home Depot. You'll see it on the back of envelopes or paper, so you know that you're buying a sustainably managed product when that stamp is on there. So forest management in Michigan. You find people, you know, harvesting timber on all aspects of land, I guess. It'd be state land, federal land, private land. When it comes to actually managing the state land, the Michigan DNR has what they call the compartment review process. And anybody that, you know, is interested in what the state has going on forested lands can come in to the compartment review process and comment on proposed treatments or harvests, or, you know, how they're managing wildlife. That is open, it's posted. You can actually find that on the DNR website. Now through that, the DNR, the state land is managed by a group of foresters. I think there's 80, 85, maybe somewhere in there, foresters in the state of Michigan. But they co-manage that with fisheries biologists, wildlife biologists. There's Parks and Rec input on there, there's fire managers. So in their process of actually managing land, they have input from several different stakeholder groups and different natural resource professionals. Now the Forest Service, they have NEPA, the NEPA Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. Anything that the Forest Service does on their land has to go through a NEPA process. Some of the struggles that they have with that act is that it opens them up to lawsuits whenever they want to do any management. So that eats up a lot of time. They're not really easily able to mobilize and work on their lands very quickly. It takes years to get through the NEPA process. So by the time that they actually are managing timberlands, they've been working on that particular project for years. And Joe, that's where your question on some of the problems with the catastrophic wildfire comes in as well too. Because of that, you know, they're not able to react quickly to problems with, you know, insect issues or thinning, you know, undesirable species, and you know, removing some of those fire ladders. So a lot of their obstacle comes there, and that's where you end up seeing catastrophic wildfire. So and I can talk more about that, you know, towards the end as well too. So management on these public lands is usually more intensive than what you'll see on private lands. So you'll see things like prescribed burns, specialized plantings, special habitat creation. For example, when it comes to, some non-game species, you'll see creation of habitat for various birds or, butterflies, Carner blue butterfly habitat, where they prefer an oak savanna and things. To do those type of projects on private land, especially in the area that we're sitting in tonight, it is difficult to do, and it just doesn't happen very often. So you'll see that the work that they do is in much larger scale and much more specialized than what you generally see on private land. So private land in Michigan, that's about 50% of what I do in my job. So I'd say half of my job is managing a supplier base. I have those 30 logging companies that I manage, and that would be, they buy their own wood directly and then they bring it into the mill. We assign them a quota or amount that they bring in each month, and then I work with them on those quotas. The other half would be working with private landowners, in the 13 county area that I work in. Some of the major differences in private land to public land is that the landowner has a choice of who manages their land, be it a consulting forester, a mill forester such as myself, a logger, a timber buyer, whatever title these folks have. Sometimes some wildlife managers or deer managers will get into that as well. I'm always an advocate for using a forester. I know that's my own personal bias because I am a forester, but I've also, taken the time to get the education to really learn all aspects of, how we're impacting the land as well too. So in the Northern Lower Peninsula, or in the area that we're in right now, almost all the private timberland is recreational. And if you think of the people that own the 40s in Oceana County or Mason County, generally they're using that to, just recreate. They're out there deer hunting, or they're out there riding ORVs or camping, or just, enjoying the land for that. And with that, most of the forestry work that is done in the state is really directed at deer management. I'd say 80% of the clientele that I work with are looking to increase deer habitat. But the one positive of that is that the benefits of that extend to many other species. So if you're creating deer habitat, which prefer, edge cover, and they prefer early successional species, you're also catering to, some of those bird species, or you're creating habitat for game birds, be it turkey or grouse. So a lot of that kind of blends over. So it really, what helps one in a lot of cases will help a lot of other species. On top of that, a lot of people will manage timber for, just perpetuity, treat it as a old-fashioned kind of tree farm. So if you have a red pine plantation, they might be interested in growing, dimensional lumber, or they might be interested in growing power poles. Other issues are forest health. We have a lot of problems in this area with invasives, and you see more and more of that. And that impacts both wildlife and I guess fauna as well too, flora and fauna.
What was that? What was that word again, Mike? I didn't hear that.
The invasives, or the
oh, invasives. Okay.
Yeah. And then, there's a lot of people that manage timber in this area just for finances as well too. So occasionally you get somebody that they need to put a roof on their house, or they're just looking to help grow their portfolio, or whatever the case may be, and they may be interested in cutting a few trees to do that. So, I advocate for a forester, and part of that is, for proper species management. In general, the forester will kind of match the timber goals to what timber is on the ground, along with, how you directly manage that is based on a species basis, or based on your landscape or your land. And then another thing is, it's important to follow what is known as BMP guidelines or best management practices. And those are things that directly impact water quality and soil health and all that. So, so a forester will help you with that as well. So, where do birds come into play on this? So you're wondering as I'm rambling on here, I hope that wasn't, overwhelmingly boring. I was looking up some numbers, and again, this is where my lack of avian biology maybe is apparent. But according to the MDNR, when I researched this the other day, there's 308 breeding bird species found in Michigan. I think that I'd seen another number of 450 or somewhere in there, but it sounds like, or from what I had read, there's several that are rare occurrences, and there's others that are extinct, and there's just a lot of changes in there. So I get apparently what the DNR is recognizing right now is 308 breeding bird species. So does that sound right to everybody? I mean, is there?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. So each of these species has a preferred habitat, but many overlap, so some will like an early successional forest, so that young regrowth, or, a shrub layer in the bottom of the tree canopy. Some prefer, a little bit older growth or a mid growth there. And with that, you also have different species of trees. So, some may like an aspen forest, and some may prefer a white pine overstory. But that said, that often overlaps as well too. So it's not always an all or nothing. And our forested area in this part of the state is cut up enough that you might have one right next to the other. So you see that overlap, and it's not totally finite, I guess. So in those forested settings, as I was alluding to, some may prefer the overstory, some prefer the mid-story, some prefer the understory. And unfortunately, due to our impacts over time, resource management for woodlands and or grassland is needed, because really, prior to European settlement here, these species were dependent more on disturbance, be it fire or tornado or just natural occurrences, as opposed to things that we don't do anymore. So fire suppression is a big one. We suppress fires when we have them. So the regeneration of some of these grass stands or these oak savannas doesn't occur naturally without our intervention. And then the regeneration also of early successional species. So early successional being, what comes from bare field. You go from bare field to shrub to early tree species like aspen and cherry. And then it'll slowly go to maple and to pine and, so on. So these early successional species, without our intervention, we wouldn't have. Some of the other problems we have, obviously, is development. Once we create a new Walmart parking lot, I mean, there's not much bird habitat there. And then once we go from, using that Walmart for 20 years and building another Walmart a mile down the street, that's even worse. The other thing is fragmentation. So forested parcels tend to get smaller over time. And you can see that even, I think half of us sitting here are kind of right in the same area of Bass Lake. At one time where I'm sitting here on my property's 10 acres. If you look at the original plat, it was platted out to be 160 acres. So you had a 160 acre plat for the original farmer that was here. He divided that up multiple times, and now we have these 10 acre parcels. And then as you get toward the end of my road, you have 1 acre parcels. And every time you do that, each landowner is doing less and less management and kind of cutting that forest into a smaller working size. So you really can't manage those parcels anymore on any large scale. Is there any questions to that? Because I know that's kind of a lot of information and a lot of rambling. So
my question is, well, I have a number of questions, but my first question is what has been the impact of autumn olive? I see the stuff absolutely everywhere now, and
Right.
I see it taking over the role of the successional tree growth. I mean, if you get autumn olive into a stand of quaking aspen, it seems to force them out over time. Is there a end in sight with this thing, or is it just something we're stuck with?
Well, it's interesting because one biologist I used to work with at the DNR said that we're moving more and more towards a global ecology, right? So all of these invasives that you see come in are probably here to stay.
Yeah.
It's so labor intensive. I mean, even in my own field, I pull autumn olive every single year. I pull it and, I'll spray it, or I'll cut it and spray it. And it's back every year. The birds love it. So from a bird standpoint, I know one time I was sitting on a parcel of land, and I was just eating my lunch in a little grass opening that was surrounded by autumn olive. And they purposely managed it around the edge of this food plot for these deer. And so I'm eating my lunch and I'm sitting there, and all the bird species that came in and were eating those berries, it was late, early fall, was just amazing, But that being said, that's also how that has spread like that over time too. They drop those later, and it's a self little fertilizer packet, right?
Yeah, and the other problem with that is the berries are good in the fall, but the birds really need the protein from caterpillars and insects earlier in the season. And the autumn olives and a lot of the invasives don't have any predatory insects yet that have adapted to them. So you don't have that for the bird broods early in the schedule of that. So that's stressed them in some areas. But you're right. They are, and I know people who make jam out of autumn olive berries. So
sure.
But boy, the stuff is tough to hunt in with those.
It is. Well, it's tough to do anything in. Yeah, it's thorny. It's unpleasant to walk through. And unfortunately, it is very labor intensive. So when I find it on private land, when I'm working on private lands, I recommend to every landowner that has it, if you're able to, treat it and keep treating it, but because it's labor intensive, a lot of people just, I don't know that they don't want to. A lot of people just aren't able to. It's overwhelming.
Is there any programs for that, Mike? Is there any grant monies for landowners to access for management of that? Do you know?
At times there's cost share programs through NRCS.
Okay.
So if you had that on your property, and especially if you're, in that 20-acre plus property, there probably is money out there for that. It typically is a first come, first serve basis. So you're best to go make friends with the folks at the NRCS office or the county forester. In Oceana County, I'm trying to remember because that's changed a couple times. In Mason County, it's Josh
Shields.
Josh Shields, yes, Josh. He's great with that stuff. So I mean, he's an excellent resource to talk to on that if there's money available.
Okay.
Yep. Interestingly enough, those pictures on the bottom are actually from a prescribed burn that I did with the DNR. It's a kind of a sequence of events that we did there, and that's managing a grassland for birds. So that grass in the foreground, if you look at the lower left picture, is just warm and cool seasoned grass mix, and then in the background is actually a stand of switchgrass that we burn periodically. And that stuff, a lot of people haven't seen prescribed fire, but switchgrass burns like kerosene. So that's probably, I'm trying to remember, I think it was about a 20-acre stand of switchgrass. You light a backing fire on it to kind of control where it goes, and then you just ring it and let it go. And you see that middle picture is at the point of ignition. Those two gentlemen have tied that fire in together. So they're both walking from opposite directions. They meet in the middle, and that's what they end up with, is that firestorm. And then that third picture would be within 5 minutes, that fire has actually consumed that whole field, and that is out. So,
Wow.
so yeah, that's I guess my example of some more intensive management of that type of stuff. I found this graphic the other day when I was looking at this. Now, you guys might know what every one of these birds are. I don't. I know probably half of them, but I thought it was really interesting in the fact, can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes.
Yep. So you see that how I was saying some birds prefer the overstory, some prefer the mid-story, and some prefer the understory. And then you also see on this other axis, you have the softwoods and the hardwoods. So as you move up, these are overstory species, these are understory species. This group would be what you find in softwoods. This group would be what you find in hardwoods. So, and then, you know, some of these overlap, obviously. So, for example, at goshawk, I know I've seen those in both type of stands. So
That's a great chart.
it is. So I've got the link on there for that. They actually had quite a bit of interesting information on there. If you wanted to quiz yourself, there's the key right there as to what each of those species are. So, I'm sure if you go back in the presentation, you can kind of move from one to the other and say, okay, what's the one on the, you know, second one on the left here is your Kirtland warbler. So that is all there. But it was interesting to me to see, you know, how those actually laid out. It kind of makes it a little more real, I guess.
Yeah.
And most of these birds, so obviously there's other bird species. These are ones that this joint venture on Forestry for Michigan Birds is kind of centering on. They might be imperiled or critically imperiled or species of concern. There's something in there. Which was interesting to me was that the woodcock fell in there. I was unaware that they were concerned about woodcock populations at this point, because I do see quite a few of those.
Huh.
So if I am managing property, where do I start? If I come out, and Gene, if I'm on your property, what am I thinking of when I walk out there? As you know, how do we start by managing that? So, you know, the first step would be to determine how your tract would fit into the broader landscape. So obviously, if you own a 40 or a 20, you know, there's a lot of bleed over from, not everything's going to stay on your property, obviously. So how does that fit into, you know, geographic context, or as the biologists like to say, juxtaposition? You know, how does it fit into that landscape? So once I examine that, I'd recommend management practices based on proper cover type and habitat. So a lot of that really comes from your soil. So where we're at, we have glacial moraines and we have sandy outwash plains, basically. So you have preferred species on each of those. After years of doing this, I can look right at the ground cover and tell you what should be there. But when I started, there were guides that would help me do that. There's published guides that the Forest Service uses, that the DNR uses, to help natural resource professionals key out what should be on a given site based on starting with the ground cover and moving up to the canopy species. After that, I'd focus on the potential for critically imperiled or imperiled species. So critically imperiled is known as G1, imperiled is G2. Those used to be called threatened and endangered. But the terminology has changed on that now at this point. So it goes down, there's a scale that goes down to, I believe, G4 or G5, which is no threat to the species whatsoever. So examples of your G1, G2 species would be Kirtland warbler, goldwing warbler, things of those nature. And then from there, I'd move on to the more common stuff. So I have a picture of that ruffed grouse on there. Most of the mix of wood that I buy is aspen, so that is a common bird that I would find in those aspen stands, and I would purposely manage those stands for for things like grouse or turkey, and that's where your deer habitat falls in as well too. So as you move down that list from, starting with, the broader landscape and, cover types, I'd move on to the on the ground practices. So if I'm working on your property, or when I was working with the DNR, I would move down the ladder here to biodiversity. So if you had a tract of land and it was generally an oak stand, and you had some scattered red pine or white pine in there, and we were planning on managing the oak to, support bird X or maybe scarlet tanager or something. We'd look at that species diversity. We'd want to leave those white pine, those red pine, just to generate or to have as many species as possible in there. If it's an oak stand, maybe we leave the white oak. Because the greater the species diversity, the less potential threat there is from some of these invasive diseases and species and things of that nature. And we always look for like diverse age classes as well too. So you don't want everything always to be in the same age class, especially when you're looking on the landscape level. And you can really see this as you go out towards Baldwin. If you get out on US 10, just as you're coming up to 37, or if you head north on 37, where all that dying oak is at, if you've been out that way, all of that stuff is basically an even age. It's all 110, 120 years old, somewhere in there. And it's all on poor soil. It's sandy. And so, the maximum lifespan for a lot of that northern pin oak and black oak is only 150 on ideal sites anyway. So that's why we have a lot of problems with oak wilt or oak decline out there. And we're losing diversity because of that, because that hasn't been managed, and that's been allowed to be in that same age class for 120 years.
How would you turn that around, Mike, on a large scale?
Well, you see intensive management. So if you look on the east side of M37, if you go up towards 7 Mile Road or 8 Mile Road, the DNR has done a lot of large oak cuts.
Okay.
Trying to get ahead of the oak wilt and the oak decline. Now on the west side of the road, that's generally Forest Service land over there. So that's where you'll see the majority of the dead oak. So you'll see that stuff really dropping out.
So that's the federals on the west and the states on the east.
Correct, yeah.
I get you. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll see that more intensive management on the east than what you'll see on the west, just because of that NEPA process that I had talked about. So they can't actively get in there and try to get ahead of that before it actually, consumes more acres. Whereas the state has the flexibility to salvage that or get ahead of those issues there.
What do they typically do then after they cut the oaks? Do they put different types of trees in there to replace them, or?
No, if you catch it soon enough, the oak just naturally regenerates. So it sprouts back up from the stump. So that's when you see like mid-age oak stands will have multiple stems. It grows in clumps. That is all stump sprouted trees. And as that tree ages, those clumps start to lose individual stems. So it self thins as it goes along, where you'll eventually just end up with 1 or 2 trees in the clump. So, and then you just repeat the process. Some areas in there, some of that is just oak decline and some of it is oak wilt. The oak wilt is a fungus similar to what Dutch elm disease would be. A beetle comes in, the tree gets damaged, the beetle senses the stress on the tree, carries the fungus with it, it plugs the pores of the tree, and then the tree just dies of, lack of water and nutrition. That doesn't happen so much with white oak. White oak's a little resistant to it. So when you're managing oak, the preferred method in a lot of cases, at least on the state land right now, and on the work that I do on private land, we prefer to leave the white oak if it's a decent sound tree. We try not to take it because it is longer living and it is a little resistant to that. Is there any more, you have any more questions on that, Joe? Or?
No, that's interesting. And I've noticed that when I small game hunt out that area, Some areas are just a heck of a lot more productive, and others are just sort of barren,
Right.
with just a monoculture
Yeah.
of kind of scraggly looking trees.
Yeah, and in those more diverse areas, have you noticed too, if you're small game hunting, you're kind of covering some territory there, just the diversity of the wildlife that you see in there is greater. And not to mention, you see more sign of deer, you see more signs of, porcupines, you just see a little bit more of everything in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Because there is a lot more diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to look at first, but it is actually in the long term the best that we can do for that resource. Also, one of the other things, when it comes to birds, so you get in some of these hardwood stands, you're really managing for canopy gaps in a lot of ways. They're finding that the methods that even I learned in forestry school for thinning hardwoods aren't necessarily the best practice anymore. They, where you take single individual trees, it turns out it's a little bit better to take, groups of trees into, half acre to maybe full acre clear cuts. You get better regeneration there, and you also get greater canopy gaps. So as it relates to birds, there's a lot of bird species that need that gap in the canopy. It's not, especially the ones that are focused on that mid-story or that understory. So that also creates quite a bit more diversity as well too. One of the other things that we really focus on managing is for soil health. And, that's to avoid compaction or avoid rutting or, some of these shallow soils that have limited topsoil on them, especially when you get in the sandy ground. We really focus on not losing that topsoil as we go along. So in real terms, in logging or in timber management, what you'll see, a lot of my contractors, I have them lay slash mats down. So they actually cut the tree tops off, they lay them on the ground, and then they use that as a bit of a road. It kind of acts as maybe pontoons, if you will, on a pontoon boat or something. It kind of spreads that weight out, and it keeps them up from sinking into the soil and does a lot less soil damage. It's hard to walk on and it's not as pretty, but in the long term, it's much better for the resource. Something else we really focus on is water quality. That benefits all wild species or wildlife species. In the past, in the logging era of the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was, we used the Pere Marquette River, for example, as a method to transport logs down to the mills. So they rolled those over the high banks, they let them roll down into the river, they floated down the river and ended up at the mills. The problem with that is that, stream sedimentation, it pushes so much sand into the water. At one point, those streams were rocky and now they're sand bottoms. And because of that, we've greatly impacted, fish species or, various other insect species that are important to both birds and wildlife. So now any kind of soil movement is frowned upon. We don't like it to go down the hill, even on the side of the road where you see on a gravel road after a rainstorm when the soil's moved down a hill to a low area. We try to avoid that at all costs on any project we're working on. And then beyond that, we kind of focus on the small things, tree retention. So we keep some of the original age class. So if it's an older stand, even in those oak stands, we'll leave some of that old oak, some of that large super canopy, if you will, for various species. We also will leave cavity trees, so things that are hollowed out for both mammals and birds, that for nesting in hollow trees. And then we also focus on our landing site retirement. So as we're logging, we move all of that product to a central landing where it's loaded on trucks. At the end of that, we as a company, we make sure that we rake those landings out, we seed them back in, we let it return to a kind of temporary grassland, for wildlife, and then it'll eventually, move back into the forest. So with all of that in mind, modern forestry is highly mechanized now at this point. So, This picture on the upper left, that's actually a job I had in Oceana County last winter time, just east of Hart. And this is the landing where they're parked. So they bring all the wood out to the central landing. This is a tracked feller buncher. Some people will call it a processor. There's slight differences in just how the machinery works, but this is what is actually used to cut trees down now. It's rare that I have a chainsaw on any of my jobs anymore. A lot of sawmills will still use crews with chainsaws because they want to minimize damage from splintering or tipping. But these machines are a lot safer to the operator, and they do a lot less ground damage than what some of those small old-fashioned cable skidders would do. And you wouldn't think that they would because they're so large and heavy, but the flotation is so high on them that they don't sink into the soil like small rubber tired machines would. So they're able to operate a lot better. The other thing is these booms reach anywhere from 20 to 30 feet out. So they can grab trees 20 or 30 feet away from where they're located on the ground and drop them that way. So they don't have to drive to each and every tree to put them down. And then that head on there will actually grab the log and set it where he wants to set it. And then he'll cut it into whatever lengths or diameters. It's all computer controlled now. And he'll sort it into various products and species right on the ground. It'll be picked up by this forwarder, and the forwarder will move it out to the landing. And then you see that in this lower picture here. That's the forwarder hauling the logs out. You can see a truck in the background. So that forwarder is loading those onto the landing. The truck driver is loading the logs onto the truck. And then you can see that feller buncher, that track buncher on there. I don't know, on my screen, I can't really see the right picture just because we're covering it. But you can see there's also wheeled feller bunchers in the woods too. Some people call these hot saws. It's basically the body of a front end loader, and it has a felling head on there. That head actually grabs the tree, cuts the tree off at the base of the ground, and then lowers the tree down to the ground where one of these processors will come cut it to length. So a lot of times, just for ease of operation and speed, you'll have one of these on the job site cutting a head of one of these, which cut it to pieces, and then the forwarder, which will pick it up and move it to the landing location. So my side note on that, it is not always pretty. And this is a harvest that is a recent harvest. It's basically, it's a DNR photo. It's a clear cut of a red pine stand. The DNR, when they clear cut that red pine, just so you know, they generally do replant that. But it is barren at first, it is devoid of trees. But the thing to keep in mind is that as a resource manager or a forester, I'm thinking in terms of decades along with other resource managers. So you're not thinking that this state of the woods is going to remain in perpetuity. You're thinking that, okay, things are going to change. You're going to move into this next segment. This is maybe a 2-year-old clear cut. So you can see some of the aspen regen in here and a little bit of regenerating pine. And you've got these various grass species in there as well too, along with some ferns. And you can see the slash from the previous harvest. So this is just the brush that was left from that. And this is maybe 10, 15 years down the road where you get into a fully regenerated aspen stand. So it's trees again. So we think in terms of those. Each species has what we call a rotation age. The DNR, when they're doing their inventory, they just flag that as they go along. It's automatically flagged in the computer. So you age the stand, you tell them what age it is. Their aspen, for example, is on a 40 to 60 year rotation. Once it hits that 40 to 60 years, they're cutting it and managing it to stay in aspen. And each species has that kind of age associated with it. It's not always 60, it might be 120 if it's hardwoods or somewhere along there, but there is a final harvest timeline. So where do you regenerate the stand? And like I say, the important thing, and that's anytime I'm on private land, I try to help folks know that, it doesn't remain the way it looks in perpetuity. Now that said, generally when we're working on private land, the normal reaction for almost everybody, and I tell them that there is a moment when that sawdust starts to fly, that there is regret that you're doing that. The forest will not necessarily, look the same again in your lifetime. But, I think of forest land ownership is a bit of a legacy too. So you're leaving a legacy for the next generation. Me as the resource manager, that is my legacy to the next generation, is, maintaining these in a healthy way. And without intervention, we tend to lose some of this stuff. So I like throwing in some humor because I know this gets a little dry. So sometimes I throw in a story of something that I've come across in my career. And this is one that several years ago when I was in the Baldwin DNR office, we got a phone call, a gentleman called, and he wanted to talk to the biologist about the wildebeest that he had on his property. And so the biologist was a very dry humored kind of guy, very deliberate in the way he would speak. So the guy calls and says, well, I have this wildebeest on my property. What should I do? So the biologist says, like an African plains wildebeest. And the guy says, no, like a werewolf wildebeest. So the biologist says, how do you know that it was a werewolf and not perhaps a dog man or maybe a chupacabra? And the guy says, those aren't real, so he says, well, what do you think they live on in the wintertime? Because, things get kind of scarce when the snow starts to fly. And he says, well, it's living down by the springs, eating the watercress. But he was concerned because the local school kids had a sled hill nearby, and he was worried about how the werewolves might end up with kids. So I guess the long and short of that is that there's all kinds of different requests for different species that we as natural resource managers manage for. So with that, I'm at the end of my slides. If you want an open discussion, I am here. We can kind of answer any questions that you might have.
I've got a couple.
Okay.
Again, I'm kind of a windbag, I know, but why has building material, lumber material, gotten so expensive?
It's kind of the perfect storm of a lot of different things happening at once. Part of it was COVID, so part of it was there was a lot of mill shutdowns with COVID last year, just because the work from home thing, and then the fear of spreading COVID. And then I know even with our production, we lost some production time because we had people at one point, coming into the mill with COVID. So every time you have that, you have to shut the mill down, you have to disinfect the mill, and that. The other thing is that there's a lot of oddly, I guess, placed, federal programs that had great intent when they were started that kind of led to things being awry. There's an oversupply of timber in certain parts of the country, the South in particular, and mill capacity over the last, couple decades has decreased. So it's kind of, landowners for a while didn't really want to sell their timber because it wasn't worth as much due to the oversupply, but you also have issues with mill capacity being down and mill closures along the way. So when we had an uptick last year with folks being off, wanting to do home improvement projects and that sort of thing, that little bit of push in demand actually exceeded capacity of output at that time. And then a lot of it too, lumber is just a commodity product. So like our pricing, we don't really control our pricing. That just kind of goes up and down with the market. So you see that, people started, actually I know of one local builder, as a matter of fact, that, when things started getting more expensive, went and bought, a couple semi-loads of lumber just so that he could complete his projects that he already had booked without, 30% increases. So there's a little bit of that stuff going on as well too, hoarding, of it. all indicators are is that bubble will burst at some point. We just don't know exactly when. So.
Do you see a trend one way or the other as far as landowners being more in tune with sustainable practices and so forth? Are they when they come to you, are they more aware or more educated on what they want or how they want their woodlot managed?
Yeah, well, so, the vast majority of the folks that we would deal with, they bought their property for hunting. So it is for wildlife, that's your standard guy that owns a 40 or 80 acre parcel. So in most cases, I mean, they're already actively managing to a degree, they might have food plots out there. I see large upticks in people calling when it comes, at the end of hunting season, for example. If they've had a bad hunting season, what can I change? Well, I can manage some timber because I read an article that managing timber would be good for my wildlife, so you see things like that. I think honestly with social media and some of the internet forums that people are a little more in tune with that, especially that hunting public. They just don't know where to start or, how to actually go about doing it or who to contact. So that's usually not a problem. Where you really get into and the ones that bother me a little bit are the ones that, grandpa owned the property forever. The kids don't want it, the grandkids don't want it, so they're going to sell the property and they just want to kind of slick it off and get as much money as they can out of it. And honestly, those aren't necessarily the projects I'm interested in, because we have goals of long-term sustainability, and honestly, I have more clientele than I can work with. So it's like I can kind of pick and choose my people that want to be actively involved. So I would say my general clientele, and my wife says this as well with her clientele, they tend to be people that are like you, that are interested in the same things that you're interested in, that you connect with more on a personal level. So in general, the folks that I work with are probably a little more in tune than what, general public maybe. So I know that's a long-winded answer of saying that, but that's, I guess, what I see.
Okay, that makes sense. I don't have any more questions. Does anybody else out there have any questions? You can unmute if you want and talk. What typically happens, Mike, is we usually have a big, so many people are busy in the summer that they have a tendency to jump on our recordings a day or two after we have these presentations.
Sure.
So we have all sorts of people, I'm sure, that are going to weigh in the next couple of days.
Okay.
And if there's any questions in that regard, I'll get those to you. But this has been really helpful for me. I found this very interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. So yeah, thanks for having me. I do appreciate it, and I do enjoy it.
And we appreciate your time as well, Mike. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, all of you have a good evening. Nice to meet each of you.
And you do the same, Mike.
All right. We'll see you guys on Bass Lake here soon.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.